Okay friends, one of the first things we have to do to get started on our job is to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all of your lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that the wheel's out of the way, we have a nice clear view of our tie rod ends. In between the two, there's going to be a jam nut. We need to go ahead and break this free. Grab onto that. Once you have it broken free, let's continue on to removing the cotter pin right here, removing the nut, and then removing the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. Now, of course, we need to separate the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. To do this, typically I like to use a hammer, and I'm going to bonk right along the knuckle right here, but of course you want to be very careful not to damage anything else. Now at this point, we're going to start unscrewing our outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod end. As you do this, count the amount of times it takes to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. All right, I got 17 for my application. Your number might be different. Now you're going to want to hold on to your inner tie rod end with some locking pliers. Of course, we want to ensure that this doesn't spin while we start removing our jam nut. Next, we're going to need to start removing the bellows boot from this area. You're going to notice that it has a couple clamps on it. One on the outer side right here, and then one where it attaches to the power steering rack. Remove them both. Inspect your clamp, make sure it's in good condition. If it needs to be replaced, go ahead and replace it. Following that boot into the rack, you're going to be able to find that inner clamp that I told you about. This one right here is a single time use. Essentially, just go ahead and break it off of there, and then we're going to replace it with a wire tie. Recycle that. Now we're going to use a pick and try to break this free. If you want to use some penetrant on this, of course, by all means. Go ahead and grab onto that bellows boot. We're going to give it a couple twists and remove it from the power steering rack. At this point, you want to, of course, give it a couple stretches, inspect it. If it looks like it's broken, dry rotted, and cracked in any way, you need to replace it. This looks great. I'll set it aside. Now we need to remove the inner tie rod end from the power steering rack. To do this, you can have an inner tie rod end tool that's essentially a tube. It's going to slide right over this and it'll be able to grab on. After that, you can use a ratchet and fully remove the inner tie rod end. For me personally, I don't have that tool. I'm going to use some long pliers. Just grab onto this, turn it to the left. Let's unscrew it. Remove it from the rack. And there it is, friends. Okay, now it's going to be time to install our brand new inner tie rod end. Something that I'm going to mention is I like to use a little bit of red thread locker right on the threads where it connects onto the power steering rack. You don't necessarily have to. We'll call it your prerogative. Let's go ahead and start this in by hand. We'll snug it up, and then of course we'll tighten it with whatever you used to remove the original one with. We'll just give that a couple little tweaks. You want to ensure that it's nice and tight, but you also don't want to damage the power steering rack by trying to over tighten this. Now in with your inner tie rod end, you're going to notice it came with a nice little grease packet. It looks just like this. We're going to go ahead and take the majority of this grease and go ahead and put it into this ball and socket area here. After that, we'll just go ahead and work the inner tie rod end around and just make sure that it's all completely inside of the joint. So now I've got a whole bunch spread inside there. I saved a little bit. I'm going to take that little bit and I'm going to go right along this area that you can see right here. So now I'm going to take my bellows boot, and if you have a clamp, you can go ahead and start it on there, or of course use a wire tie like I did. I just have it nice and loose. I'll slide it onto the power steering rack. Once it's situated, we'll go ahead and tighten this up. Now the reason why we added a little bit of grease along this area here is so when the alignment professional does your alignment, the boot's not going to get twisted as they make their adjustments. Let's go ahead and tighten this up. Trim off the excess. Put on your outer clamp. Make sure it's completely situated. Copper never sees. Go ahead and put on your jam nut. We're going to screw this on approximately halfway. Now it's time to install the outer tie rod end. Of course, when we do this, we're going to be putting it onto the inner tie rod end, and of course we're going to be turning it clockwise, the same amount of turns as it took to remove it initially. 1, 2, and so on. Now we can take this, line it up with our knuckle, put put on your nut. Once you have this snug, go ahead and torque it to 35 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to do is ensure that the castle nut is lined up with the hole of the stud of the tie rod. If it's not, you need to continue tightening until it is, and then we'll go ahead and put in our locking cotter pin. Now it's time to go ahead and lock down this jam nut. Let's press it all the way up against the outer tie rod end. We'll snug it up, and then you're going to torque this to 59 foot-pounds if you have the ability. Okay, now you notice when I was tightening this, I made sure that I held the outer tie rod end while I did this. The reason for that is because I don't want to be twisting the outer tie rod end and potentially damage it along the way. Now at this point, you just want to double check everything that you took apart, make sure it's put back together properly. After that, let's go ahead and get our wheel up on here. We'll start all of our lug nuts on, snug them up, get the wheel on the ground, and then we'll torque them all to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, so we got our tie rod in there. What's left to do now? Go ahead and safely take your car for a road test down to your local alignment shop for a 4-wheel alignment.